Welcome to this lunch seminar of Researcher's Desk. Today we have the pleasure of welcoming Fernando Racimo. I hope I pronounce your last name correctly. Fernando is an associate professor at the University of Copenhagen, and today he's here to talk with us about his book, Science in Resistance, The Scientist Rebellion for Climate Justice. Fernando, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Jeanette and Alistair, in general researchers desk for the invitation to be here. It's really nice to be speaking, especially given that it's a Swedish group, as I actually live in Sweden, even though I work in Denmark. And it's also nice to see some familiar faces in the audience. Yeah, today I'm going to be talking about this book that I wrote recently, Science and Resistance. And like Jeanette said, I'm an associate professor. My background is in ecology and evolution, but I'm increasingly doing work sort of at the intersection of climate justice and degrowth, and academic activism. And I'm a member of various social movements, and one of the movements that I'm a member of that I've done quite a bit of work with is Scientist Rebellion. And so this book was, I partly wrote it because I wanted to document the origins and the evolution of this movement. But beyond the particular movement, I also wanted to document the motivations, the emotions, the feelings that go through scientists, academics that decide to step out of the ivory tower and engage in activism with a particular focus on direct action, given the particular movement that I was following. I also wanted to take a close look at the institution from which scientists and activists emerge, so academia, universities, and how in many ways this institution, academia, is highly complicit in fossil capitalism and in fossil colonialism. And so I also wanted to think about how universities and academia in general could be transformed to actually serve as positive agents for change, and under climate and ecological breakdown, and also increasingly societal breakdown and the rising threat of fascism. But beyond this, like very academic reasons why I wrote this book, I also wrote this book because doing science today is a little bit batshit crazy. We're studying a world that is actively being killed. And our response to the killing, the massive killing, is we're just going to keep studying it a bit more, and then we're going to do some more studying of the killing, and sometimes we're going to ask those who are doing the killing to, pretty please stop. Sometimes we're going to ask them for money so we can continue studying the killing. And I think this contradiction that is something that many scientists are increasingly feeling, including scientists that are not involved in social movements or in activist collectives. This sort of double reality that exists between our sort of purported role as scientists, as deliverers of facts, and actually what is happening around us, which is that a lot of the facts that we're given are not being heard. I mean, it's very hard to think that what Trump needs as he thinks about invading Iran and Greenland and Venezuela, whether what he needs is another paper on biodiversity decline, and whether he is actually going to read that. So I'm I think a good antidote to this state of double reality is to actually engage in social movements, and this is something that happens that happened to me, and that happened to a lot of the people that I interviewed for this book. I interviewed over 24 scientist activists who realize how it is that one actually can enact change, how one can influence society in ways that go beyond sort of the very accepted standard roles of scientists as sort of publishing papers, and sometimes involving like sort of very polite discussions with policymakers. Thinking about other tactics, other strategies that scientists have pursued in the past in other movements, that go beyond this, and how they can be quite effective at transforming society. The book is a little bit of a historical account. It especially starts as a historical account of this particular movement, Scientist Rebellion. This particular movement started in 2019, when several scientists were calling out the rest of the academic community for not joining in the big climate mobilizations of 2018, 2019. There were several papers by scientists sort of calling out the academic community. There was a very famous one by Charlie Gardner and Claire Wordley saying, academic scientists have been the ones who produce all this knowledge about the state of the crisis. But how is it possible that we're not, out there in the streets, shoulder to shoulder with all of these people that are demanding change? Um, there were two scientists at this time in 2020 that were especially calling out the academic community for not engaging in direct action, given that there were so many groups at that time that were engaging in direct action, like Extinction Rebellion, the Fridays for Future, and the Sunrise Movement. And so the book begins. Let me see if I can. Yeah, it begins with these two people, Tim Hewlett and Mike Lynch White, who in 2020 visited the Royal Society of London. Mike Lynch White is a theoretical physicist, and Tim Hewlett is an astrophysicist, and they visited this institution, which is one of the most prestigious scientific institutions in the world. It's also an institution that has been highly complicit in British colonialism and imperialism. And they went to the headquarters of this institution, which is near Buckingham Palace in London. They pasted a letter on the door of the building saying, that the Royal Society is producing all these papers about biodiversity decline and climate change, all this knowledge about the terrible crisis that we're in, and yet scientists in this institution are not acting as if we're actually in a crisis, right? It's almost like, we're talking about the end of the world as we know it, but we go back to our universities, our institutes, and just drink a cup of tea and sort of see the world burn. And so they were also throwing paint at the columns of this institution as a form of civil disobedience. They chained themselves to the stairs of this institution, and the police arrested them. They spent the night in jail. The two people that were taking photos of them also spent the night in jail for unclear reasons. But this was sort of a catalyst. It was an event that was very widely spread on social media for many academics and scientists to start joining in groups that were embracing direct action, like Scientists for XR and Scientists Rebellion. This is a quote from Tim, who's one of the people that I interviewed for the book. So he says he's trying to explain why we're targeting the Royal Society at the time, and he says, the truth is that fossil fuel capitalism can only exist with the tacit or explicit support of scientists or of academia. Academia is a fracture point, a place of weakness you can target to help bring the system to end sooner rather than later. And sort of this idea of academia as a pillar of fossil capital can be seen through different angles of analysis. One way is just the very obvious way in which fossil fuel corporations and other types of extractive corporations are trying to flood universities with fossil money to influence curricula, to influence research agenda. Just in 2022, UK universities took 40 million pounds in different types of contributions from fossil fuel companies, and this is also the case in many other places in the US, in the Netherlands, here in Denmark and Scandinavia. We also see it through how the fossil fuel industry influences other types of scientific institutions beyond universities, like publishing companies. Elsevier, which is one of these major scientific publishers, has been revealed to be sort of a major collaborator with fossil fuel companies, hosting expos for them, developing tools for fossil fuel companies to extract as much oil as possible. The parent company of Elsevier, Relics, has been funding climate denialist politicians for several years. And I actually interviewed a person that used to work for Elsevier that got fired for calling out Elsevier's ties to the fossil fuel industry. We also see this in the sort of purported science policy bridge, things like the COPs or even the IPCC report, which is supposed to be sort of this massive report of information about climate change delivered to policymakers so they can actually act. Increasingly, sort of even the IPCC report as sort of this liberal institution where the idea is that scientists talk to the politicians and politicians act is sort of increasingly harder and harder to believe as a thing that actually is happening. Like Trump is pulling out even its own scientists, IPCC scientists from the US, from the IPCC. But one can also see this in the way that it's often more the other way around, like sort of politicians trying to influence what gets said in the IPCC report. Scientists Rebellion famously leaked a version of the IPCC report that was written before politicians had a chance to edit the report. And the leak showed, once you compared it to the actual report that got released afterwards, that politicians were trying to erase sort of scientific calls for the immediate phase out of coal, for the emissions of the ultra rich from flight emissions, and they were trying to add more and more sort of bullshit things, like carbon capture and storage, these technologies that won't scale and are just a way for the fossil fuel industry to sort of validate its own activities. Also, a lot of mentions of geoengineering and erasing all the stuff about coal phase out, about oil phase out, about the need to dramatically decrease the emissions of the ultra rich. We can also see this in sort of more the present day. If you just look at the news today, I mean, science is in some sense both repressed today, but also highly complicit under techno-fascist capitalism. In the sense that it's repressed, science is repressed in many ways. We see it very evidently in the US, where Trump is trying to silence climate science, ecological science, public health science. Also here in Europe, there's been a crackdown on many academic freedoms, especially with the genocide in Palestine. Many scientists have had to quit their jobs, have been fired just for speaking out about fossil fuel imperialism, about capitalism, about colonialism. But one can also see science is highly enmeshed in the structures of fossil capital. A lot of the major technologies that are enabling repression and oppression today at a massive global scale would not be possible to be created without massive amounts of scientific expertise, scientific infrastructure. This includes AI surveillance systems, generative AI, this sort of the bullshit creation technologies. Also, just the entire fossil fuel industry highly relies on scientific expertise and academic expertise. This is very well summarized by writer Peter Garrelos, who talks about how ecocide is a highly technical process. Not a single one of the industries responsible for destroying our home has developed without the integral participation of academically trained experts. Not a single oil well, not a single gold mine, not a single fracking site. Scientists are shaped by the same mercenary pressures as all high-value laborers in a capitalist economy. And I think this is something important to keep in mind, because we often think of sort of science under attack, which is, it is, science is under attack, especially right now. But at the same time, we also need to recognize what type of science is under attack, what forms of practicing science are encouraged, and whether science is sort of completely sort of this guiltless activity, or whether there's particular ways of doing science that are highly conducive to fossil capital and fossil colonialism. This idea of targeting our academic institutions or scientific institutions has been sort of a core part of scientist rebellion, not just in terms of sort of the complicities of science in the crisis that we're in, but also the complicities in our silence, right? And the fact that even though we have this massive amounts of science talking about the crisis, talking about the fact that we are in deep, deep trouble, with massive amounts of emissions, massive declines in biodiversity, scientists in general have been quite quiet about this crisis, in the sense of like not acting as if we were in a crisis, or publishing a lot of reports, but not really acting like we're in a crisis. So a lot of the actions that SR carries out is about trying to disrupt academic and scientific institutions. And this has been particularly the case in the early years of SR, where scientists were targeting museums of natural history, of science, many museums of science that were funded by fossil fuel companies. They were targeting publishing corporations. They were also targeting major conferences. The picture on the left here is the American Geophysical Union conference, which is I think it's the largest geophysical and geological conference in the world, and it was famously disrupted by two scientists, Peter Kalmus and Rose Abramoff, calling out scientists for not being out in the streets, not being out there shoulder to shoulder with activists. And for this, actually, Rose Abramoff got fired from her job just for displaying a banner at a plenary. In Denmark, where I work, Scientist Rebellion arrived soon after that first action by Mike and Tim. At the time in Copenhagen, there had been a climate law that had been passed. This was back in 2021, and it looked like the government was actually going to start acting on climate, on decreasing emissions. But then they started to reneging on those promises and not actually doing anything, and promising that actually most of their climate action was going to be investments in carbon capture and storage. And so scientists were very pissed at this. They were very angry. And so back then in 2021, we decided to do this teaching in which we invited several professors, several academics to give lectures about climate change and biodiversity collapse in front of an audience, sort of a classroom of students and activists, while we were blocking the road in front of the climate ministry as a way of sort of signaling to the public that politicians are not really listening to scientists. They're mostly listening to fossil fuel and other extractivist companies. And this event was highly publicized in Denmark. It appeared in every major news outlet in Denmark. It led to the birth of Scientist Rebellion in Denmark. Soon after, we revisited the same ministry a few months later. We again were blocking the road while reading fragments from the IPCC and also holding scientific papers. At this point, Scientist Rebellion in 2021 had expanded to several countries, over 25, 26 countries. And so while we were doing this action in April 2022, actually, sorry, not 21, 22, at the same time, scientists in Spain were throwing beetroot juice at the steps of the Spanish parliament. Over 40 scientists protesting at the parliament for lack of action by the Spanish government. Many of them are still going through trial processes for this action. In the US, Rose Abramoff and several other scientists, they chained themselves to the White House fence. There were several scientists that were chaining themselves to Chase Bank in Los Angeles, which is a major fossil fuel funder. In Germany, scientists were blocking the road in front of the German Reichstag. In the UK, scientists were throwing this black ink at the headquarters of Shell. In Italy, in the Netherlands, scientists were occupying or blocking the offices of major fossil fuel corporations. In Sweden, there were protests in Stockholm as well as a teach-in in Lund. There was a strike by scientists in Oslo, in Norway. And there were also protests in Uganda, in Congo, in Nigeria by scientists, academics, and students. In Ecuador, scientists were blocking the environmental ministry. And in the country where I was born, in Argentina, there was also another teaching by scientists. And this is a tactic that the movement pursued for several years, or doing actions in coordination to amplify each of the events that were happening in each of the individual countries. It happened again in October 2022, in May 2023, and in November 2023. It also served to connect struggles across borders because a lot of these fossil fuel structures span multiple countries. One of these major atrocities that is being built by fossil fuel companies is the ECO pipeline that is being built by Total and several Chinese oil companies from Uganda, from Lake Albert, where the oil is supposed to be extracted through Tanzania to the port of Tanga, and there the oil will be shipped off to markets in East Asia and Europe. So this is also a form of dispossession of energy from the African continent, at the same time as being a major environmental disaster and displacing tons of communities from this area. This is an international action, so one can have different groups from SR, from Uganda, Nigeria, Rwanda, Tanzania, Kenya, targeting this same pipeline, and that sort of amplifies the action. There's a quote from a scientist activist from Rwanda who says that when we do these actions internationally and the narratives and demands are the same, local politicians are surprised at the amount of attention we get. Many people will bump into our actions online, and that amplification helps to spread the message farther and much faster. And VECOP is an internationally funded atrocity by banks and institutions in Europe, North America, and China, and South Africa. So one can also do actions in all these different countries at the same time. Scientists do actions. They come to learn that science is never neutral, and so beyond it, the book being a sort of a historical account of the movement, it's also kind of a reflective account of what happens with scientists as they engage in activism. And so I try to revisit some of the scholarship that many fields of scholarship, including feminist, critical studies fields, decolonial fields, have done to actually address the fact that science is never neutral. Science is always shaped by societal, political values, and that one needs to be aware of those values, of those situations when one carries out any kind of scientific activity. So there's a lot of work that has been done by feminist scholars on sort of this critique of scientific detachment, as well as by decolonial scholars and indigenous scholars who have often called out sort of, the purported neutrality of science as really just a particular claim to objectivity, which is really a subjective position, and it's the subjective position often embraced by the Western white man. As scientists carry out activism, they also learn about their own activities, their own identities as scientists, and what that implies. Um, I think in one of the book chapters, I talk about the emotions that go through scientists as they engage in activism. There's a particular chapter in which I talk about a climate scientist called Lou, who studies glaciers in Greenland, and how she engages in this major protest against this lignite coal mine in Germany, this massive coal mine that is destroying forests and entire towns, and the emotions that go through her as she engages in activism, and how that makes her actually change her research activities. And she ends up stopping her work in Greenland and doing something a bit more grounded, by doing work in somewhere more nearby in Norway. To account for the fact for the destruction that her own research involves as she carries out her science. Um, the Another way in which sort of scientists change themselves as they engage in activism is we often meet people, activist groups, indigenous groups, environmental. Uh, that sort of puts us in a position of humility. We learn that a lot of the things that we are told are effective for climate action are really not that effective, and that in order to actually mobilize people to engage in collective action, we need to be listening to people that may not be academically trained, might not be working in academia, but that have been successfully fighting against fossil fuel and other types of extractivism for decades, if not centuries. This is a photo from SR Ecuador. This is Jordan Cruz, a member of SR Ecuador on the left, and Alicia Kauya on the right, talking to him. He's a leader of the Guarani people. The Guarani people are this indigenous group that inhabit the Yasuni, which is a major tropical forest in Ecuador, underneath which there's a ton of oil reserves. And so the Guarani have been fighting against oil extractivism in the Yasuni for many decades. They recently won a major victory for climate justice in Ecuador, in this massive series of protests in which indigenous groups, together with worker groups, student groups, and also scientist groups, got a referendum to be passed, in which over 50% of the Ecuadorian population voted against oil extraction in the Yasuni. This was a major victory, but it was only possible because many different groups allied together across different sectors of society. And also because a lot of the protests were guided by the wisdom of indigenous environmental defenders that have a lot of knowledge about how governments and corporations try to get into sites of oil extraction and manipulate population and politicians, how one can fight that back. Um, as scientists, activists carry out activism, they often encounter repression, increasingly violent repression against climate activism. Here in Europe, it's becoming more and more common for things like pain grips to be applied on climate activists, as well as other forms of repression, not just on climate activists, but also on other types of social justice and decolonial justice activists. We see that in Germany. This is a picture from Germany, from a climate protest in Germany. Often, now in the news with all the pro-Palestine protests, we see it increasingly also with repression of decolonial activism. In Sweden, this is also very evident, not just in terms of repression, violent repression that might happen as an action is unfolding, but also all the repression that happens after an action might happen through courts, through police surveillance. There's a very famous example of David Alser, a scientist activist who, with Otterstal Vodmarker, I'm hoping I pronounced that correctly, interrupted this Eurovision event, and calling out for basic things of the Swedish government protecting the wetlands. And he's been followed by the police. He's been detained without reason by the police. Now he's being threatened to be deported just for engaging in a peaceful climate civil disobedience. And it's sort of like jarring, how much sort of like the very veneer of democracy is falling apart. And this also calls out the need for our communities to stand in resistance and in solidarity with people like David that are putting so much on the line to fight for a livable future. And of course, all of this is relative. I mean, many scientists, many academics are resisting repression even by just carrying out their work, carrying out their everyday lives. We see this, for example, when we look at academics, scientists, students in Gaza, in Palestine, where every university, every institution of higher education has been bombed through either bombing or destroyed through bombing or through controlled demolitions. And yet, academic scientists continue to teach, they continue to practice their different fields of scholarship, sort of harnessing education and scholarship as a form of resistance. And so it's important to look at this sort of these examples of what resistance can look like under unimaginable odds and unimaginable amounts of repression from Western colonialism and imperialism. The example of Palestine brings me back to Mike because Mike was spent quite a long time in jail. I think he spent one of the longest sentences for activism in recent years in the UK. He was jailed for, I think it was about 2 years, not for the work that he did with Scientist Rebellion, but for work he did with Palestine Action, which is this other civil disobedience group that has been recently proscribed in the UK. So he was dismantling a weapons factory in Runcorn in the UK. These were weapons that were going to be shipped to Israel to kill Palestinian people. And for this, he suffered a very long sentence. But I interviewed him after he came out of jail, and he told me. So he gave me some reflections on his own journey of activism, but also on the evolution of the Scientist Rebellion movement. And one of sort of the criticisms he has towards Scientist Rebellion is that he hasn't focused enough on academia, on the university as an institution in service of fossil capital. So I think increasingly, even though this was a strong focus at the beginning of the movement, increasingly Scientist Rebellion is doing more focus on like targeting corporations or targeting state institutions. But I think it's important that we remember universities and academic institutions are also highly complicit with fossil capital. And all the different ways in which academia today, through various processes of bureaucratization and neoliberalization, particularly in the last 4 decades, has been structured in order to promote sort of capital accumulation through imperatives to overproduce, these sort of publish or perish incentives, the idea of like artificial scarcity in the job market, how not all, but many jobs in academia are precarious or short-term contracts, and that places a lot of fear and restrictions on what academics can do and how they can engage in the causes that matter to them, and the proliferation of metrics and managerialism serving the logics of infinite growth, often serving corporate interests, and how they have been proliferating in the university, replacing sort of collective decision-making processes by decision-making processes that are top-down, that go from the top to the bottom. There's been a lot of calls in academia to democratize and decolonize our academic systems, and I think this is an important focus for all scientists in coming years, how we can degrow, decolonize, and democratize our universities so they can actually become places in which scientists and academics can actually feel safe to argue, to engage with the causes that they believe in, whether that be climate justice, social justice, or anti-colonial justice, or feminist justice, LGBTQ justice. One example that comes to mind when I think about democratizing our academic systems, one of these waves of rebellions in October 2022 that I was involved in, it was in Germany for a series of actions in Berlin, in which we were targeting the transport industry, so particularly how the car lobby in Germany was trying to prevent public transport laws, affordable public transport laws, from being enacted in parliament. And even though there were a lot of very public actions, very sort of actions that were covered by the media, one of the things that was not covered by the media is all the work that was happening in the background, all the gatherings that were happening by scientist activists in this warehouse in Berlin, in which we were talking about the actions, planning the actions, but also building community, sharing food, sharing wisdom about activism, doing stencils together, doing the glue that we would use to paper paste in various actions. Also seminars with other activist groups like Debt for Climate that were teaching us about various struggles in the global south and how they were connected to struggles here in the global north. as well as a lot of art, a lot of music. And there was also psychologists that were helping us process our climate grief. And to me, the cool thing about this is that all of these people were scientists, they were academics, and they go back to their silos in their different universities after these actions. But this shows that it is possible for scientists, for academics, for students, for the people that make the university run, to run it differently, more democratically, more horizontally. Another example of this is the famous climate camps that precede often sort of these big actions in which there's a lot of collaborative decision-making process, a lot of horizontalism. A lot of activist groups in history have practiced sort of these practices of democratic decision-making, horizontal decision-making, like the Occupy movement. And it's also something, this sort of community building as part of activism is something that's very present in Global South activism. In my country, in Argentina, there's often ollas populares, these sort of common pots in which people share food, even as they carry out particular protests. We also see this in the climate camps, the Palestine camps against the genocide and against the complicity of universities in funding the genocide in Palestine or in collaborating with genocidal institutions in Palestine. A lot of these camps that were occupying universities in the global north were organized very horizontally through a lot of deliberative democratic practices. And they were quite successful at sort of running a university otherwise. They were giving out documentaries, lectures, a lot of collective cooking and cleaning. And they were showing the universities that they were occupying, we could be running our university differently, but we're not because of all these hierarchies that prevent actual engagement in the things that matter today. So I think an important focus for scientists and academics moving forward is to look at our own institutions, academic institutions, and think about how we can modify this towards practices of sufficiency, of slow science, working with labor unions to secure the means of our subsistence, radicalizing our labor unions to connect labor struggles with climate struggles, with anti-colonial struggles, and thinking about how we could transform our universities away from managerialism and towards practices of economic democracy, so that the people that actually make the university run, the faculty, the students, but also the cleaning staff, the cooking staff, have an actual agency in deciding how the university is run and for what purposes it is run. An example of this is, for example, the Ecoversities Alliance, this alliance of global South universities that are run very horizontally, very democratically, and often in the service of the local communities in which they're embedded, often supporting social movements, fighting for liberation across multiple places across the world. So this is, I think, my last or next to last slide, just some reflections or takeaways from the book, but also the book tour that I was just in. I was touring Europe over the last November and December last year. And I got to meet a lot of different scientist groups, a lot of activist groups, a lot of communities of resistance. And I think one of the most important ones and the main takeaway from the book is to remember that academia is also a terrain of struggle and that we need to be pushing for academic democratization and decolonization, especially now when there are increasing conditions of fascism where, like fascist leaders are increasingly targeting the few managers at the top. And we need to make to build power from the bottom so that sort of these weak points, the rectors and the deans that might be very eager to cater to the desires of politicians in power, are not the only ones making decisions for how universities are run. We need to strengthen and radicalize our unions, resuscitate labor power. Remember that academics and scientists are also workers and we're also exploited, and we need to collectively organize for change. We need to be better at connecting environmental and labor demands. This is a general reflection for the climate movement in general. Meeting people where they are, and often that might be sort of about getting to the end of the month rather than thinking about the end of the world. Thinking about whether scientific narratives are legible or relatable. Especially in groups like Scientist Rebellion, we often talk about things like very scientific concepts like parts per million in the atmosphere of carbon, or climate tipping points, or planetary boundaries, which are all very useful concepts, all very useful scientific concepts. But then they're not super legible, especially for somebody that maybe is not scientifically trained. And so bringing things down to the things that actually matter to people, which is, like affordability of public transport, affordability of housing, living costs, freeing all the wealth that is being hoarded by the elites, so that we can actually have, good lives. And so being better at sort of narratives that connect to the things that actually matter, and maybe a little bit moving away from these abstract concepts that have emerged from scientific papers and academia. Uh, those are, again, important concepts, but they might be sort of like the fourth sentence in a discussion about climate activism. It might not be the first sentence. The first sentence might be, can you even afford to make it to the end of the month? And why do you think that is not so? Remembering that no one is coming to save us. I think increasingly, I guess, again, with the rise of fascism, we need to organize more locally in our neighborhoods, in our workplaces, escalate action, but also and pursuing tactics like occupying things, also pursuing institutional action. We're thinking about sort of local councils, town councils, regional town councils, and how activism or how climate justice demands could be pursued there, but also coupling those with generative action, showing the world what other worlds we're precluded from living. If we're occupying an area, maybe turn that area into a repair shop or a repair library or an agroecological farm. Don't neglect politics as they are today. So this example of Mandani and other local politicians that have been very good at sort of connecting environmental and labor demands, as well as anti-colonial demands and politics that they're pursuing. Thinking about the scientific and cultural work that needs to be done to create the conditions for all the undoing. We need to undo the entire fossil fuel industry, and that involves a lot of engineering work, a lot of technical work, a lot of political work, a lot of sociological work, a lot of ecological work. How do we undo a pipeline? How do we undo a coal mine? These are questions that are not really discussed in the hallways of academia. We're largely focused on abstract concepts like, rising temperatures, or in sort of false solutions like geoengineering and carbon capture. And I think we need to be talking in our classrooms, in our hallways about how do we undo fossil fuel infrastructure? How do we destroy Shell? How do we make it so that Shell doesn't exist tomorrow? Thinking about adversarial research, all the people that are running these corporations, they have names and addresses, they have ways of operating, tactics, and learning about their tactics and their strategies. And all the academic work that needs to be done to legitimize popular knowledge and struggles. Thinking about all the work that we could be doing to lend credence to ongoing struggles that are often not driven by academics, but where academics can lend a hand. So that's the book. You can get it in most online retailers. Avoid Amazon, because they're horrible, but they're available through, for example, bookshop.org, which supports local bookstores. I'll end with this quote by Ursula Le Guin: "You cannot buy the revolution, you cannot make the revolution, you can only be the revolution. It is in your spirit or it is nowhere." Thank you so much.